Ken Campbell. I'm the director of the news office, and today's session has become a embargoed private briefing for the Knight Science Journalism Fellows at MIT. The embargo is for 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Tuesday, May 2, which means that it should not appear in any publication any place in the world before then, and we've been getting great cooperation from the press to adhere to this embargo. We've used this embargo because this is a very complex story, and it's not one that you can just whip off in a half an hour. So you need to have some time to look at it and study it, and then write a more comprehensive story than is ordinarily available under deadline. So I'd like to turn the proceedings over to Michael Dertouzos, the chairman of the commission, and first Paul Gray, the president of MIT, will speak and introduce Professor Dertouzos.
Good morning, and thank you for coming. We're here today because we have an urgent message to convey to America, to its financial and industrial community, and to the millions of Americans who rely on industry for their livelihoods. The message is that American productivity is slipping, even though the United States is still the most productive nation in the world. The weaknesses in American industry concern the way people think, cooperate, invest, manage and organize themselves, as well as the ways they become educated, use technology, learn a new job, and interact with government. We need to rethink the way we do business and the way we live in the world. International industry is driving along a highway of many lanes. The U.S. is ahead right now, but we're driving in the slow lane. Other nations are speeding along behind us, and some are about to zoom past. Why is MIT concerned? As a science-based university concerned with the education of engineers and scientists, MIT is deeply involved in industry, in science, technology, and productivity. We believe manufacturing is absolutely essential to this nation's economic future. Technology is the main engine that drives the economy. That's the message MIT economist Robert Solow has been teaching for 30 years. The problem of U.S. productivity has been studied by economists, by social scientists, by engineers, and by scientists. But up to now, no one has thrown them all together in a room to thrash out this problem, to study it from the factory floor on up in the United States, in Europe, and in Japan, and to see what MIT and other universities might do about it. That's why I appointed 16 MIT faculty from the schools of science, engineering, from the Department of Economics, and from social sciences to this committee in November 1986, and asked them to wrestle with this problem until they came to a shared perspective, a common view about the problem and about what might be done about it. I should note that this is the first such effort we've undertaken at MIT, at least since World War II, and perhaps going back much earlier than that. We have with us today Professors Michael Dertouzos, Richard Lester, Robert Solow, Suzanne Berger, and Lester Thoreau, 6 of the 16 commissioners. Michael Dertouzos, the chairman of the commission, is professor of computer science and electrical engineering and director of the MIT Laboratory for Computer Science. He's played a major role in fostering cooperation between industry and universities in the computer field, and he's been a leader in innovative curriculum development in computer science. Made in America, Regaining the Productive Edge reports on the conclusions of this commission, what MIT and other leading universities should do to contribute to improving U.S. productivity, and what industry must do to get us back in the fast lane. Now, Professor Dertouzos will give you a 20-minute summary of 2 years of work which involved more than 75 people. He will then introduce the other panelists who are here, and we will try to respond to your questions. Michael?
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The message that we are in trouble is by no means shared today, nor was it shared when we started our work by the people of this nation. Some people said then, as they say today, that the U.S. is in big trouble. They say we've lost automobiles, we've lost textiles, they say we've lost consumer electronics and steel. They also say that U.S. products are becoming expensive and of lower quality compared to foreign products. Our annual trade deficit is huge at $120 billion, And United States productivity is growing slowly. But there are others, especially our leaders, who tell us that we're second to none. And it is true that while US productivity is growing slowly, it is nevertheless the highest in the world. Also, unemployment is low, and our plants are working at close to full capacity. So who is right? Are we in trouble, or are we okay? As the President told you, the verdict of this commission after 2 years of work is that the United States industrial performance is indeed in serious trouble. And this matters a great deal, because if we do not mend our ways, all Americans will pay the price in terms of our standard of living. But to correct this problem, we must first understand it. Unfortunately, if you string together all the accounts in the press and all the scholarly studies that report on this issue and on the weaknesses of American industrial performance, you get a list so large that it is unbelievable. So we set out to separate the important from the unimportant in our own way. We took a different approach from most other studies that treat the US economy like a box with knobs that you turn to control exchange rates or interest rates. It's not that we do not believe in macroeconomic factors. We just don't think they're adequate to explain or correct the nation's productivity problems. So we based our work on a bottom-up study of these 8 industries, which are shown here along with the trade balance. They include winners and losers, and together they account for some 28% of United States manufacturing. We split ourselves into 8 groups and carried out 550 interviews in 3 continents, concentrating on what happens at the factory floor, in the office, and in the boardroom. We also formed a 9th group, which looked at education, both at school and at work. We then took all these results from the 8 studies of the industries and the 9th group of education, and we pulled them together and searched for common patterns of weaknesses. None of the weaknesses that emerged from this bottom-up study will be new to you, since, as I said earlier, every conceivable weakness has been brought forth. What is new in the MIT results is which of the many reported weaknesses emerged as actual patterns from this bottom-up study. There are only 6. First weakness, outdated strategies. In the best US and foreign companies, mass production has given way to short runs of sophisticated, high-quality, customized products. Yet, we have found that the bulk of US companies still cling to an inflexible mass production strategy that worked well in the days of Henry Ford. Workers are still treated like cogs in a wheel that must be kept turning no matter what, the wheel of production. This older, rigid system turns out to be less productive than the newer, more flexible ones. So that is one of our outdated strategies, clinging to mass production. But there is a second. We are also parochial. We still look to the United States as the sole source of everything, and particularly of technology. US companies, for example, were late in introducing the basic oxygen furnace or the Kawabata measuring system in textiles. Both were foreign technologies. We also assume that others share, or at least they should share, our tastes and the way we do business. As did one of our companies that we studied, that shipped a huge quantity of sweatshirts to Europe, expecting that they would sell as well as they were selling at home, and found out, of course, that they did not. But let us move on to the second weakness. Short time horizons. Now here is a familiar pattern. A famous American electronics company faces competition at the low end of its market, say the transistor radius, from a Japanese company or companies. It abandons that market to Japan. It holds on to its higher-end commercial electronics products, and then it turns around and it buys a rental car company or a finance company. Now, they do this because they believe that it shows a higher return on investment, a higher ROI. Meanwhile, the Japanese company builds its knowledge and expertise in this area, builds up market share, holding profits low or zero, and eventually assaults the higher-end commercial electronic products of the American company. And so it is that in consumer electronics, where we once produced 90% of what we consumed, we're now down to 4%. By not sticking to their knitting, as we call this behavior, US companies end up losing both expertise and market share. Now, it is often said that the high cost of capital is the culprit that pushes our companies toward a short-term orientation. The Commission agrees that this is a factor, but we have found other factors as well. For example, these ROI calculations, when in error, tend to favor the short term. And the investing strategies of fund managers who control a lot of the stock of these companies value companies with short-term profits. Third weakness, technological weaknesses in development and production. The United States is first in the world in inventing new products. Transistors, color television, VCRs were all invented here. Yet, none of these products, or hardly any of these products, are made here today. And the products that we make, for example, automobiles, have a larger number of defects, in the case of cars, almost 2 to 1, compared to Japanese products. It's almost as if we've spent so much energy inventing that there is none left to convert our inventions into products. In fact, we do spend 2/3 of our industrial R&D money on the inventing side and 1/3 on the processes that make products out of these inventions. In Japan, this ratio is reversed. Beyond that, our attitudes, too, favor invention over production. We glorify the inventor, and we feel that a career in manufacturing spells sheer drudgery. We tend to design quickly and debug later, whereas in the best companies, both here and abroad, people build quality into the design. We also look for breakthrough strategies. We look for that aha that is going to solve our problems. And we do not believe so much in the incremental, steady, gradual improvements that are favored by the world's best companies. We even have this word or this phrase in our culture. We say, if it ain't broke yet, don't fix it. Fourth weakness, neglect of human resources. First and foremost, we neglect education at the kindergarten through 12th grade level. The United States, a nation that pioneered mass education, is now ranking, through its students, high school students, worldwide in various exams from math to geography and reading, between 8th and 15th among the nations of the world. And this slippage is happening at a very wrong time, when the new systems of production call for greater technical literacy in the workforce. This educational problem of the United States youth is perhaps the biggest weakness that we face. But there is more. We also neglect our workforce. We tend to view labor as a cost factor to be minimized rather than a precious asset to be nurtured and developed. Let me explain. Our vocational schools are not effective. And on-the-job training, on which our companies spend over 50 or 60 billion a year, involves either remedial training, like reading and arithmetic, or following Joe around to learn how things are done. By contrast, in Japan and in Germany, workers undergo systematic job rotations that make them broader, more flexible, and more willing to learn new skills. As a result, when a plant fails in the United States, some centralized team has to be brought over to correct the damage, and that takes time and induces delays. In Japan and Germany, most of the time, failures of plants are handled by the operators because they've been trained broadly enough to understand all the aspects of their plant, thereby saving time and money for their companies. Fifth weakness, failures of cooperation. We found this at several levels. First, there are failures of cooperation within our companies. Here is a pattern. The designers design a product, they toss it over the wall to the production people. The production people try to build it, it doesn't work very well, they write some corrections, toss it back over the wall for redesign. This ping pong goes on and can be traced to induce delays in the production process. In copiers, in automobiles, and in other products, we have found these delays to amount to as much as 2 to 1, compared to companies that do not follow these practices. But there are other failures of cooperation. There are failures of cooperation between a company and its suppliers. In the US automobile business, for example, as in other businesses, we find in this country thousands of suppliers, whereas in the best of companies, both here and abroad, one finds hundreds of suppliers, same business. Also, there is a difference in the way we deal with our suppliers. In the US, the relationship is based on an adversarial thing, the contract, and the specter of potential litigation. Whereas in the best companies, the relationship is one of cooperation and sharing a mutual goal. We also found failures of cooperation among competing companies. Now you would say, why should competing companies cooperate? For one thing, to develop common standards. In the numerically controlled machine tool business, for example, we have found that in this country, we had great difficulty in agreeing on a language for these machines to talk to each other. The Japanese had no such problem. They got one company to construct the controllers, and they settled on the language. Never mind that it wasn't the best language, it was common. And apparently we haven't learned yet, because in the area of computer networks, we have exactly the same problem today. We have one standard for almost every company that we have that makes networks. Sixth weakness, government and industry at cross purposes. When we started our study, our friends from business told us that too much government was what was causing their difficulties and America's productivity plight. Now, our industry studies did not bear this out, nor did they bear out the opposite. What we did find is that government and industry are going their own way, following their own agendas, oblivious to each other's needs and aspirations. Now, if you're becoming depressed by all this gloom, let me say that in our industry studies, we were also heartened to find common patterns of best practices. Those companies that do as well or better than their foreign adversaries in the international arena. Since what we found out is included in our recommendations of best practices or imperatives, if you wish, I am going to try to save time and move on. Now, studying the weaknesses in America as well as the strengths isn't enough, because that takes us only up to now. We need to look at the future. So the Commission tried to identify future trends that would govern business And we came up with 3 broad such trends. We believe that the world will become even more international than it is today, and therefore even smaller. Second, people will expect and will get higher quality, more sophisticated products. Third, technology, and particularly information technology, biotechnology, and material technology, will become more critical to the production of goods. Now, these trends spell out a quickening of the pace, the need for US companies to be more agile, more flexible, and more sophisticated if we are to compete effectively in the world. Now, the MIT Commission combined what we learned from studying these weaknesses, the strengths, and the future trends. We put them all together to come up with our recommendations. There are 5 imperatives that, if followed by industry, by government, and by the nation's educational institutions, will help America regain its productive edge. I will describe them briefly and broadly. The book spells out what they mean for each of the players, namely industry, government, and educational institutions. First imperative, focus on producing well the new way. What do we mean by that? For one thing, we mean that we must stop putting finance ahead of production. This business of manipulating financial instruments from one mirror to another is no way to create new wealth. And we must focus as much attention on production processes as we do today on the inventing of new products. Our managers, too, will no longer be able to remain detached, saying, as they often do today, I can do anything. Point me. What do you want, paper clips or jet aircraft? I can make it. Tomorrow's best managers will need to know their product intimately. Second imperative, cultivate a new economic citizenship. As we have seen, the old rigid system where each individual worker and each supplier is a cog in this large wheel of production, and if they don't behave, you toss them so that the wheel can keep turning. That old system of production works no more. Employees must now be given greater breadth, greater responsibility, and broader on-the-job training in order to be productive with the new, sophisticated, and flexible systems of production. And since so much more is being asked of the workforce, they must also be rewarded, both with participation in the firm's gains and with greater employment stability. But we can go beyond the utilitarian notions that we need to treat workers well so that they will produce better, which is true. We can go beyond that. There is an unprecedented opportunity here to give the United States workforce a new sense of mastery of their work environment, a greater job satisfaction. And that's why we call it a new economic citizenship. Third imperative, blend cooperation and individualism. When the stakes are high, we have shown that we can do both, as do the Boston Celtics, or more seriously, the best of companies in the United States. Now we can take some practical steps too. We can begin doing this by flattening organizational hierarchies, which now run 17 layers deep from the boss to the lowest person in a company. And we can begin rewarding with bonuses both individualism and cooperation in companies. Fourth imperative, learn to live in the world economy. We must learn foreign languages, cultures, and practices if we are to compete in the world arena. And we must shop internationally for the best technologies wherever they may happen to arise. We must also establish national policies that will help us save for productive investment and balance our budget. Finally, we should invest in the future by investing in infrastructure, both old and new. Just as an example, the Commission thinks that we should begin investing in a new national information network that will be to information and business in the 21st century what the highway system was to the transportation of goods and the economy in this century. Let me now conclude with what the Commission believes is an important observation. These 5 imperatives are not a menu. They are not a menu from which you can pick and choose. They work together. Let's get them in focus here. They work together like a well-oiled mechanism to bring human resources and technology together into a highly productive overall system. In fact, this is the main reason that when we studied the best practices in the US, we found that they didn't diffuse as widely as we thought they should. I mean, if these companies are doing so well, why aren't their practices being copied? We believe that the reason is that those companies that are doing so well are doing most, if not all, of these things. As a result, if another company wants to imitate them, they must undergo so many changes and so many wrenching changes that it's not easy. And that's why those practices are not diffusing. Now, in closing, we of the MIT Commission on Industrial Productivity believe that industry, government, and the educational institutions of the United States can indeed pull together to carry out these imperatives. This will require a great deal of effort and a considerable change of attitudes, but it must be done. If we want to live well, we must produce well. There are no shortcuts. On behalf of the Commission, thank you. Now, as you ask questions, please identify yourselves and your organization. And may I ask the panel to please come up? We have no floor microphones, so we will have to rephrase your questions. And before we start, let me introduce our panelists. You've already met President Paul Gray. Next to him is Professor Robert Solow, our Department of Economics, Nobel Prize winner in economics, 1987. Next to him, Professor Richard Lester of our Nuclear Engineering Department. Professor Lester was executive director of the commission, and Professor Solow was vice chairman. On your extreme right is Professor Les Thoreau, dean of our Sloan School of Management. And ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for your questions. Yes, sir.
My name is Christopher Lott. I'm an science journalism fellow here. And my question is, I was hoping you could paint a picture for me of what the nation would be like if none of these imperatives are met. If we keep plugging along and the way we are now, and try to paint a picture in a way that would mean something to a guy who drives a taxi cab or works in a bakery.
The question is if we can describe what would happen to America, presumably the standard of living of America that I said would go down if these imperatives are not met. Who would like to take this question? Gentlemen.
Let me
Les.
take a stab at it. I mean, there are two things. One is that if your productivity is growing but at a relatively slow rate, it means that parts of your population are going to have falls in their absolute standard of living. And one of the interesting things at the moment in the United States, and if you talk about plugging along, you look at what's been happening in the last 10 years. If you take the group the Department of Labor calls non-supervisory production workers, which are about 2/3 of the American workforce, that group's real wage is 8% below its peak in 1972 and is currently falling at a rate of a little less than 1% a year. And that, so if you think of the bottom 2/3 of the American workforce, the answer is that you should expect a slow decline in your absolute standard of living. The other problem, of course, is if the rest of the world's doing better, you also get a decline in your relative standard of living. And I suppose a good example of that would be Great Britain, where in 1900 they had the world's highest per capita income. Their income didn't go down, but now they have a standard of living that's about 2/3 that of what would occur in the most advanced developed countries like Germany, the United States, or Japan. And so there are two-barreled answers. That part of the American population will suffer a decline in their absolute standard of living, and most of the American population would suffer a decline in their relative standard of living.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Charles Ball, MIT News Office. Was the commission able to identify any system, nation, or government that might well serve as a model for the picture you're presenting?
Do we have a nation or government that could act as a model for what we are saying here? Professor Solo.
There's a short answer to that. I don't think the Commission in any way believes that we ought to try to turn the U.S. into Japan or into West Germany or anything of the sort. We have our own ways of operating, our own culture, our own normal patterns of behavior. We think that some of them have become unfunctional or doing us harm rather than good, and those can be changed without altering the fundamental character of the society. We'll still play baseball in the spring, we'll still play hockey in the winter, and the U.S. will look very much like the U.S. Inside factories and between corporations, that's where the differences occur.
Yes, sir.
Apparently, there is no fast solution. Apparently, there is no fast solution. I am Victor Rosano. I am a fellow here. And my question is the following. I don't think solutions are going to emerge pretty soon. It takes time. What is you can do with this?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question. Did you hear?
It has to do with the schedule.
Somebody rephrase it from the table, please.
No, I think the question is that these kind of changes take time. And if you're thinking about, are we talking about a series of changes over the next 10 years or the next 20 years, and how much time is there to make these kind of changes? As I interpreted the question, that was it.
Gentlemen, anyone wants to take that question?
Well, I think the answer is that we are not talking about the sort of change that happens one Thursday at 11 o'clock in the morning. Many of the things that we've described, that Mike described, have already started to happen in American industry, and they will, we hope, accelerate in the next years. There's not a cliff that one falls over. There's not a catastrophe hanging out there on the edge that one runs the danger of incurring. Lester pointed out that the cost of not doing this is damage to the standard of living of our children and damage to the relative position of the United States in the world. Not a single catastrophic event, but a drawn-out process. We start reversing that tomorrow, or in fact, we have already started reversing that last year in many industries.
Paul Gray.
These imperatives have different time constants in terms of change that might occur. In some cases, such as the changing the economic partnership, as it was described, within a company, changing the way in which the workforce is perceived, managed, used, change can begin rather quickly. Another aspect of that related weakness, which was described by the Commission, hinges on the quality of education, pre-college education in the United States. The fact that roughly 20% of the adult population are functionally illiterate, the fact that in understanding of simple mathematics and in science, we tend to rank towards the bottom in every comparison with other industrialized nations. It's going to take a while to change that. It's going to take some time to bring about change in the quality of pre-college education across the nation. But it seems to me we need to begin on it rather quickly.
The book lists approximately 11 or so, I think, ways in which business could undertake these imperatives, translate or interpret these imperatives. I'm not going to mention them here all, just mention a couple. For example, flattening the organizational hierarchies. That can be done overnight. Our large companies can reorganize themselves, and they do overnight. Developing and adopting new measures of quality. For example, instead of measuring the quality only in terms of profits, one could adopt explicitly measuring the quality of the product and keeping track of it. Integrating the functions of design, production, marketing. This has already been happening in the best US companies, the teams in the ProPrinter project at IBM and in the Ford Taurus project. So there are many of these ways of attacking early. There are others, as President Gray said, that will take much longer, especially in the area of human resources. More questions?
My name is Klaus Eckler. I'm a Knight Fellow. I have a question for you. You said that to obtain a decent product quality, which is competitive within the world market, it is necessary to buy, to look for suppliers worldwide. That could, for example, mean that you import Japanese chips or Japanese parts. On the other hand, you have this huge trade deficit. How do you lose this contradiction? How do you find a solution?
The question is, how do we reconcile the recommendation that we shop for the best technology wherever it may arise with a huge trade deficit of the United States? And the answer is directed to me. So I will try to answer it. Putting restrictions, doing protectionism is really no way to solve the problems before us, because it invites retaliation and it invites all kinds of complications that later haunt everybody. And I think the essence of your question, if there's one answer to your question that's protectionist, that's what I would say about it. So we have no alternative but to go for what we've been preaching throughout the birth of this country, which is a free market economy, and buying the best technologies wherever they arise. This is not where the problem is. The problem in America is in converting the great inventions in which we're number one in the world into high-quality products. And we simply must learn to do that, and that is what our imperatives are directed to. Next question. Yes?
Knight Fellow. How can the government inspire companies and businesses to follow these imperatives?
The question is, how can the government inspire the businesses to follow these imperatives? Who would like to take this?
Let me take a whack at it, because I don't
Professor
think that's a
Thoreau.
governmental responsibility. In some sense, that's the responsibility of the press and the media. Because one of the things you're supposed to do is bring to the American public, or any public in the world, some view of what the rest of the world looks like. And one of the things we're talking about here, in some sense, is that the rest of the world has copied some of the good things in the United States, like mass public education, and then they've upped the intensity level and done it better than we have traditionally done it, which means we've got to up our intensity level and kind of leapfrog once again. And so I think it's a real question of, in some sense, are the media telling the average citizen in the way in which the average citizen can understand it, that his or her world has changed, and standard good old American operating procedures that used to work 30 years ago won't work today, simply because the world's different. And I don't think it's Mr. Bush that's going to solve this problem.
Does the report have any specific recommendations in respect of the use of the mass media to increase scientific literacy?
Does the book have any specific recommendation about how the mass media could help increase scientific interaction? Is that what you asked?
Scientific literacy.
Scientific literacy, technical literacy, I see. Yes. It's a long book, so we have to do a little bit of scanning. One of the things, look, the problem is very complex, and one cannot look at the answer to your question as the panacea, but let me just cite a couple of things. The universities, on the demand side, the universities are the ones who take the students that come from the K through 12 level. And there we say that we might increase our standards and demand a higher preparation in technical topics. But that alone, of course, is not enough. Something must be done on the supply side, on the teacher side. Got to motivate the students, take into account the demographic changes and the changes in the ratio of the population that is going to be here in 10, 15 years, so that a lot more has to be done on that side as well. But there is one possibility. The other possibility that is discussed in the book is lengthening the school year, which in America is now one of the shortest among the school years in the world. Yes?
I'd like to go back to Dean Thoreau's comments about the media's responsibility. I think the imperatives that were brought forth today are exciting, but they're also not new. It's a story I've heard before, and I think other people have heard. The message has been out for a couple years that America is not number one anymore in everything. The changes are happening, but they're happening awful slow. What can people do to speed that up? And I do think the government plays a role in that process.
The question is like to come back to the same issue, that this is not a new message. These are known things. And what really should be done, what should industry, government do to really get things going because they're so slow? I would like to ask the panel to consider answering your question while I give you an answer to the statement you made, the assertion you made, that this is not new. As I said, none of the weaknesses you heard is new, because there have been hundreds of weaknesses paraded in the press. But that is very much like a person suffering from a large number of diseases. And so he's told, because everybody who comes by sees him, sees that he's sick, and he says, "You've got disease X." The other person says, "You've got disease Y." By the time they're done, he hears that he suffers from 100 diseases. And then a doctor comes in and measures the temperature and the blood and all the good things and says, "You've got only 3 diseases." And then the patient says, "Oh, go away. I've heard about these diseases. These other 50 people told me about it." Now, I want to really contest the statement that these results are not new. The MIT results are very new because they tell you which combination of those things you've been hearing forever matter as you study the problem from the facts, from the bottom up. So I think it is new. And I think before that, at least we of the Commission face this myriad of recommendations and questions and diagnoses, and you really couldn't find your way through there. Now, with that as a basis, perhaps I can...
May I say 2
First
things,
Solo.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
First, I'm going to reveal my age and tell you that I remember when Rita Hayworth was everybody's idea of a beautiful movie star. And in my youth, there was a joke that we told. A girl says to her boyfriend, "What does Rita Hayworth have that I don't have?" And the boyfriend thinks for a minute and says, "Nothing, but she groups it better." And our hope is that we have grouped it better. But now let me come to the rest of the question. Somebody asked earlier, and Les answered that question particularly, what can the government do to inspire this sort of change? And I think that Lester gave the right answer. We are not anticipating inspiration from the government in this respect. Most American corporations understand the problem that they face, and they need not so much inspiration as a little bit of guidance and some energy. I don't think that Lester meant to suggest that there is nothing that public policy can do to improve or speed up or facilitate this process. There's lots of public policy out there that's needed. The report does not spell out proposed pieces of legislation or regulation or anything of the sort. We didn't think that that was the right task for a group of MIT faculty. But there, one can easily infer from what we've written that policies that stimulate saving and investment in the American economy, that make it easier for corporations to take the long view, to commit funds for risky and long-term development projects, technological development projects, any such policies, and we all know what they are actually, would be useful. The federal government in this country has long played a role in supporting and providing incentives for research and development activity both in universities, in nonprofit research organizations, and in corporations. It ought to be doing more, and not only ought it to be doing more, but I think it's a fair inference from what we've said that we would like to see the government support of science and technology include support focused at that part of technological development that lies somewhat closer to the commercial production end, and not simply basic research, which is where the government has specialized up until now. So I think you ought not to think of this group as believing that no public policy could be useful or even necessary for this. There's lots.
Let me make an addendum too, and I think I probably was a little unfair in my earlier answer, because I think we also need some leadership from Washington. And let me give you a couple of illustrations. You remember back during the vice presidential debates in this presidential campaign that Vice President Quayle basically implied that if people in Indiana grew Belgian endive, that was somehow unpatriotic, because somebody had claimed that you would make more money growing Belgian endive than you would American corn. Well, you can think of Belgian endive, if you like, as a new technology found abroad, a product which you can sell for a high price. And if you can grow Belgian endive in Indiana and sell it for a lot more money per acre than corn, then you ought to be growing Belgian endive. But if you're so myopic, you say the only thing Americans can do is grow corn, of course you're then in trouble. And I think what we need is some leadership at the top that understands that we have a problem. Now, my impression is that I think our leaders do understand we have a problem, but they have convinced themselves that in order to get elected, you have to pretend that you don't have a problem. And I think what that does is confuse the public horribly, because you read about all the problems in the press, and then during our political campaigns, our leaders all deny that there are any problems. And then if you're an average person, I think you end up just conflicted. You say, well, maybe there's some problems, but somehow these guys are running the countries and they don't think there are any problems, or at least that's what they say. And so I think one of the things we have to do at the government level is put it out on the table what we believe about these problems, as opposed to saying that the only thing that sells to the American public in an election campaign is gross, rank optimism.
The book has 9 points, which are recommendations to government, and they're the translation of these imperatives. Yes, sir.
Why do you think that the people, the recipients of the message is the broad public and not the people who are responsible for the changes in the corporations, for the directors? Wouldn't it be more effective to bring this message directly to these responsible people?
The question is who ought to be the recipient of our message, the public or the more responsible people? I presume you mean corporate executives, government officials?
I think the answer in the United States has to be both, because we don't quite have an establishment in the sense that some other countries have an establishment that can kind of, in some sense, ram things down people's throat. And so when you say the American establishment or the Japanese establishment, I think you're talking about very different groups of people and what they can do. And since we don't have an establishment in the sense that Japan has an establishment, I think a much broader group of people have to be convinced that change is necessary in the United States than perhaps have to be convinced in some other countries. And of course, the other thing that is true in the United States that you have to remember that is not true, for example, in Europe, most Americans never leave the United States. 9 out of 10 don't leave the United States. And so they have no experience with the rest of the world and don't see these things firsthand. Well, if you're a European, just when you go on your vacation, you're going to see some other countries, be someplace where somebody speaks a different language, where the refrigerators don't look exactly the same, those kind of things. And so I think this problem of kind of educating Americans as to what the rest of the world is like and how it forces them to adjust their procedures is much harder, simply because we are so large. And there are 5 million Americans that go to Europe every summer, but they're the same 5 million every year.
We have a couple more questions here. You were first, yes.
I think that some of those...
Could you identify yourself?
My name is Nina Walkman, I am a Met Fellow. I think that some of those changes, like production ahead of finance, are really difficult and change the educational system. So I think after this book you have those suggestions. How do you think you could implement them, like forming committees with leading persons from the educational institutions and industries and government, like to form a leading group, like to implement those suggestions. And also if here at MIT you are already thinking about doing something like that?
Okay, the question is what's the best way to implement, or how are we going to implement what we preach in this book? Professor Lester.
Well, let me address the MIT part of the question. One of the things that the report points out, and that Mike mentioned, is that we have observed in a number of the industries we looked at weaknesses that we've called downstream technical weaknesses, weaknesses in product design, process design, manufacturing. And to some extent, although not entirely, that set of weaknesses can be traced to developments, an evolution in the way we think or have thought about engineering education at MIT and at the other leading research universities and technical universities. Within the last couple of years, as you may have heard, we have made a number of attempts to rethink that to some degree. And one of the things we've done is introduce a program, a master's program, joint with Sloan and engineering, directed towards increasing the production, if you like, of people, engineering and management-oriented people who know about and will practice manufacturing. That's one of the things that we've tried to do. But in fact, our report calls for a broader approach to some of these problems within MIT, in which we would hope that right across the institute more attention would be given, for example, to production, real manufacturing production problems. Also more attention, as Les was talking about, to the international aspects of this problem. So we think that there are a number of things that we can do at MIT, and maybe other research universities should also be doing to make us at least more responsive to some of these problems.
This, of course, is what we should do at home, which comes first, and we spell out quite a bit of what MIT and other universities should do. Insofar as industry is concerned, besides putting out our book, we're having a lot of meetings with the commission and CEOs of companies, groups, the alumni of MIT, so we're spreading the word that way. And insofar as government is concerned, we are having a briefing at the executive branch next Monday, and we're having a briefing in Congress in the afternoon, and we're testifying before Senator Kennedy's committee on Wednesday. I think we're doing the best we can, which a university can do, which is to disseminate its results through the media and through the written word. Yes, ma'am.
Do you already have reactions from industry to your report?
Yes, we do. We have several reactions, and perhaps they are our friends, but they're running fairly positive. In fact, the back of the book has quite a few endorsements from industry. We better wait until this is out and see the other comments as well. Yes, sir.
I'd like a little more information about some of your evidence. Are there some specific companies where you can point to companies that are in a similar situation as each other, but you can say this one looks at profits 10 years from now instead of next quarter and does a better job? This one treats workers as an asset instead of a cost and has succeeded better. What are some specific?
The question is to give some specific examples of the studies we have done. I'd like to call on Professor Lester.
Well, I think one of the most striking comparisons that emerged from our work came out of the steel industry, where we looked at both integrated steel companies, large companies that basically do everything, but also we looked at we had spent some time visiting some of the mini mill companies, which have been quite successful over the last several years in grabbing market share from the larger companies. And we did see very striking differences in many of these dimensions. One dimension in particular that I'd point to would be the way these companies handled human resource questions. One of the most striking pieces of evidence in this respect concerned Chaparral Steel, which is a small mini mill company located in Texas. In order to learn about what was going on around the world in their particular field, and in order to import the best practices, both organizational and technical, that company sent groups of people, including production workers and maintenance workers, as well as white-collar people within the company, sent them around the world, gave them travel funds, said, you go out and learn what you can about what our best competitors are doing and come back and implement them. That company also, for example, sent its production workers out, people that worked on the line, so to speak, to talk to their customers, to find out what those customers thought of their product and what they could do to improve it. What one saw in this particular company, and I think this is an example that would apply in a number of other industries, what one saw was a kind of a breaking down of some traditional functional areas and functional activities within a company, making the company more open, so to speak, to the flow of information from outside. And this was a fairly strong contrast from what we observed in some of the older, larger steel companies.
Let me just give you an extension so you can see more examples. The second half of the book, Made in America, is full of various of these examples in the 8 industries. And 3 weeks from now, we're publishing through the MIT Press the 9 volumes. They're actually 2 volumes, but there are 9 sets of working papers of the Commission, which include all the detailed examples, so that you will have an ample opportunity to get more of the bottom-up material that drove us to our conclusions.
Well, see, part of this is also just kind of a mindset. Now, this is not a comparison so much among American firms, but if you look at the textile section of this report, the conventional wisdom kind of the United States is textiles is a low-wage industry, and you can't compete in textiles if you're not mainland China and paying $2 a day. The problem with that conception is that there is a very successful high-wage textile industry in a country like Germany. And it may be true in textiles you can't do everything and pay high wages, but if you very carefully put it together, in fact, there's a very viable, reasonably large textile industry that can be built that is survivable in a high-wage industrial country, as the Germans demonstrate. And so the question then is, can you put that kind of thing together in the United States? And there doesn't seem to be any intrinsic reason, because you can find individual firms that are starting to move in that direction. But the problem is you have to do it as a whole industry. You can't do it on an individual firm basis, because if you got one firm that is very good at making cloth, that doesn't save the industry. You've also got other people, got to have other people who can put together the garment part of it, perhaps the chemical part of it, and so forth. And so, you know, it is possible to do some things that were, and if you have these blinders that say that's impossible, you just abandon an industry that shouldn't be fully abandoned.
We have just a couple of minutes left, so let's see. You had a question.
I just wanted to follow. To the extent that some of these differences are obvious in companies that exist or are observable, and your comment that other companies see these as successful but can't switch. It's too wrenching. They can't survive as a company necessarily if they try to become, if U.S. Steel tries to become Chaparral. How does some of these changes mean that there has to be a different set of companies, that we're going to have new companies that are built on these new principles, or can the existing companies make these changes?
The question is, of course, since these changes, the imperatives are so many and so wrenching, what does this mean? How are we going to be able to diffuse them in American industry?
Well, I suspect the truthful answer is there are going to be some companies that can't change and will effectively go out of business. But you can find examples of big companies that are trying to make these kind of changes, and I think some reasonably successfully. I suppose one of the examples that would be common today, you know, if you think about Ford.
Well, let me give you an example which hasn't played itself out yet, but is, after all, on the largest scale, roughly with this sort of thing in mind, although not precisely, of course, the details that are in this book, when the General Motors Corporation decided to build a car that they wanted to call the Saturn, they decided to build it almost as an entirely separate company. Different place, a sort of self-contained management, simply to be almost independent of the rest of the corporation. So if even sort of the archetypical big corporation like GM can do that, then I suppose other corporations can do the same.
The famous German luxury cars, the Mercedes-Benz and the BMWs. And so, you know, it is possible to recapture these markets. And you see examples, if you look at luxury cars, where the sales of foreign luxury cars are down, you can turn those things around.
Okay, 2 more questions, yes?
Some economic practices and beliefs are very deep root in the American society, to the point that they look more to foreigners like dogma. For example, intervention of the state in economy. and the evidence in other countries shows that there is a lot of intervention in every country. How could you conciliate that economic culture with the fast evolution of the American society? And this is related with the battles in the Congress. Could you describe a shopping list for the Congress?
I think the question has to do with the fact that there seem to be some deeply rooted some cultural aspects in American society, and how do we reconcile this with what we are doing and what we advocate that we should be doing, right?
I am referring to the economic aspect, to the economic theory and beliefs, to the economic...
Or that there is a different mindset in this country about economic beliefs, is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
and the participation of the state in the
The
economy.
involvement of the state in the economy. I see, I see. Well, I don't know. One of our two distinguished economists, or
Let me take a
Professor
first
Lester.
whack at it. I think your statement is basically right, that we like to pretend that we're pragmatists, but in some ways we are very dogmatic. And when it comes to the idea that government can't do anything well, I think we are extremely dogmatic. And I think that's a bit of dogmatism that we're going to have to modify. For example, if you look at research and development in every country in the world, at least half and usually 2/3 of the funds, one way or another, come from government. And government plays a very important role because of what economists know as externalities. And we're going to have to face up to some of those realities. Now, obviously, the trick of any society being successful over the long run is, can you change your dogmatism? You may be a crusader at every point in time, but you crusade for different things as the decades roll along. And I think that's going to be the test over the next 2 or 3 years, is can we decide which of these dogmas are really functional in the 21st century and which of these dogmas in some sense have to be discarded to be successful in the 21st century.
Actually, no, I think that part of it is the easiest part of it. Government is the sphere in which the human race has developed the greatest capacity to say one thing and do another. That is not a vast, I think the harder problem will be what you might describe as the culture of industry. The notion in this country, for instance, that trade unions and management are bitter enemies and must always be bitter enemies. And concessions or cooperation between them is a sign to the rank and file that somebody is being betrayed. That sort of thing. The notion that industrial operations have to be simplified, that the ideal way to produce something is a complicated object is to break it down into the most elementary bits so that an uneducated person or even a primitive robot can do it. That's the sort of thing that I think will be harder to change, and it will change not overnight, but in an evolutionary way.
Professor Lester wanted to comment on that.
Well, I think Bob said pretty much what I was going to say. Those kinds of changes don't seem to me, at least, to be changes that you can legislate. This is not the kind of thing that government can pass laws about. These are attitudinal changes, sometimes quite fundamental changes, that will have to take place over a long period of time and involve all segments of society, not just or even primarily government.
I know you have a lot more questions, but we said we would stop right now. Let me just close this briefing by giving you a point of view on this question. Let us not forget that this nation is a little bit different than other nations. It is not homogeneous. It has in it people from every possible land, and it has proven in the past that it can adapt to change. When it comes to culture, I personally do not believe that the cultural differences are behind what we have seen here. You see the NUMMI plant, where American workers are doing just as well as the Japanese workers in terms of the defects of the cars that come out and so forth. So I think that the 5 imperatives list what are the things that have to be done. This nation has enough youthfulness in it, enough diversity in its various ethnic and cultural groups to be able to cope with it. And if we pull together government, industry, and educational institutions, we believe that it can be done. Thank you very much. No need.